If you've seen any of my other videos where I'm analyzing music, or maybe one of my Instagram posts where I'm analyzing a short chord progression or a jazz lick, you also see me reduce long rows of chords into a few simple functions. And that's really how I want to think about music. That's how I want to understand what is going on. I want to have an idea about what are the important chords and also what is the basic idea of the movement with these chords. So I don't only want to understand what the chord is related to the key, I also want to have an idea about how it flows from one chord to the next. And that's also really a description of how this chord progression sounds. I think that's really important in theory, that we have a way of thinking that actually fits with how the music sounds. And to me, using functional harmony and tonal harmony is the best way to do that. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. My name is Larsen, learn jazz, make music. The first advantage is that we can group the chords together by how they sound and how they work in the progression rather than what type of chord it is. And that's simply because not all dominant chords have a dominant function. A minor chord, like a minor 7 chord, can be a tonic chord, but it can also be a subdominant chord. You have to look at it in the context to understand what's going on. So if we take the diatonic chords in C major, then we would have C major 7, D minor 7, E minor 7, F major 7, G7, A minor 7, B half diminished, and then C major 7. And we have 3 groups that we can assign these chords to. So we have a tonic, a subdominant, and a dominant category. And if we look at this, so this is clearly in the key of C major. So the tonic group would be C major, the root of the scale. And E minor 7 is also a tonic chord, so is A minor 7. And then for the subdominant, we'll have the 4th degree, the F major 7, and also the 2nd degree, the D minor 7. And for the dominant, we have a G7 and the B half diminished. A simple illustration of how this works: if we take a simple 1, 6, 2, 5 in C major, so C major 7, A minor 7, D minor 7 to G7, then for this progression, you can hear that if I exchange the C major 7 for an E minor 7, then that sounds almost the same. E minor and the C major 7 kind of belong together as both tonic chords in this key because they sound similar and you can use them in the same kind of places. A similar example if we're talking about subdominant chords. So if I have a 4, 4 minor, 1 progression, so the 4 minor, actually maybe I should just talk about that also because that's a huge chunk of chords that are very common in jazz standards and in jazz music in general. The 4 chord F major 7 is a major chord, but in C major you can also come across minor subdominants, and those are then going to be sort of F minor type chords, and there are quite a lot of those. I think the most common ones would be sort of the different variations of F minor, so that would be F minor 7, F minor 6 and F minor major, and then you can also have B flat 7, the backdoor dominant, which is kind of like an F minor with a different bass note. D half diminished is common as well, and A flat major 7 and D flat major 7 are also fairly common minor subdominant chords in a major key. But that's of course a little bit off topic. So if we go back to the subdominant chord here, if I have a progression that goes 2, so D minor to F minor 6, 9 and then back to C major, then essentially as a function what's happening here is subdominant, minor subdominant, and then back to the 1 chord. And we can of course also substitute the D minor with an F major 7, and then we will have this progression. So exactly the same chords except for the first chord, and you can hear how it sounds very similar and how it makes sense to group those 2 chords together. If you want to see a solid breakdown but also a fairly efficient short video about how you build chords in a scale or in a key and how you divide those into functions, then check out this 12-tone video, which is actually really useful for just giving you an overview of that. I'll link to it in the description and of course also in a card here in the video. When you understand the function of a chord and you start thinking of progressions as these sort of logical movements between functions, then it gets a lot easier to play some logical lines over them, because you're not only thinking about the chord that you're improvising over, you're also thinking about the next chord and where it's going and what the point of that chord is. And that really helps you think ahead, and that makes you make lines that are a lot more logical, because you're already thinking, I need to play on this chord, But the important next thing that happens is this function, and that means that I want to hit one of these notes to be really clear about that, and I can play towards that, and my line will have a natural flow. And this is really one of the things that jazz kind of, especially bebop, has in common with Bach very often. You will hear Bach pieces also have this sort of direction in them and really move from one place to the next in sort of a very linear fashion. Usually when we are playing chord progressions like jazz standards, then in fact the progressions are pretty embellished, so there are a lot more chords in there than there really has to be, and they're just there to help the flow of the song and keep it interesting. And sometimes it can be really useful to just dial back the amount of chords that you're playing and then really understand what is the basic structure. And that's especially useful if you want to solo over them, because sometimes you want to ignore some chords, otherwise you're just going to spend your time just running up and down arpeggios, and it's not going to be that nice of a solo. So an example of this could again be the 1-6-2-5. So if we have C major 7 to A minor 7, D minor 7, G7. Now in this case, C major and A minor are both tonic chords, so that whole bar is definitely tonic function. So D minor 7, G7 is of course, strictly speaking, subdominant to dominant, but here the dominant is more important. So if you reduce these four chords, you could actually say that it's just C major to G7, but you do need to realize what's the more important function, because if you had the same kind of progression, you just say, well, we just reduced a 2-5-1 into just the dominant chord. But if you then have E minor 7 and then maybe an A7 chord to D minor 7 to G7, if we do the same kind of analysis on that one, then we could say that we just take away the 2 chord, and well, E to A, that's also 2-5, so really what we're going to be playing is A7 flat 9 to G7, but that doesn't really sound the right way. That doesn't sound like the turnaround anymore. And that's because really what's happening here is that this E minor is not a 2 chord, it's a tonic chord. So that's actually more important than the A7. The A7 is a secondary dominant, so that's not really much more than an embellishment in this context. And then we take that away, and then we're kind of left again with something that's tonic. So C major or E minor going to something that's G7. So here it's really important to understand what the progression is in terms of what is important in this context, in this key, and it may look like it's 2-5, but it's not always really a 2-5. Learning how to improvise over a lot of different chord progressions actually becomes a lot easier if you start thinking in functions and reducing the chords to really the basic function that's there, and then improvising over it from that point of view. And that's really because there are a lot fewer functions and a lot fewer chord progressions with functions than there are with different chords. So if you're thinking in terms of this chord is a major 7 chord, then it can still be all sorts of things and you have to improvise over it as if it's a major 7 chord. But if you're thinking about, well, this is really just a subdominant chord, then it's the same as all the other subdominant chords, and you have all this material that you can use on it. And that really helps you improvise over similar sounding progressions in a lot of different songs. So as an example, if you have, let's take the 4-4 minor idea again. It's very common for jazz standards to have a 4-4 minor back to 1 at some point in the progression. And if we're in the key of C again, then that would be something like F major 7 to B flat 7 to C major 7. But if you know that it's just subdominant to minor subdominant to the tonic, then you can also see that it's actually the same that happens when you're playing over a D minor 7 to B flat 7 and then to C major 7. This means that you can play the same kind of line over it, because the same types of notes, or the exact same notes, are in fact going to be important. And the main thing that happens here is that we have the A moving down to the A flat, down to the G and the tonic chord. So if you make a line that does that, then it will work on both of those progressions. And if you're thinking from this is what happens in this type of progression, then you've solved a lot of problems and you have a lot of material that can be used in many different songs. So just to show this, here's one simple line and how that works in a few different variations of the same progression. But we can actually also turn this way of thinking around. So instead of just putting it all together in one group, then we can also use the different specific chords to generate new material. So that means that if we are playing over a C major 7 and that's a tonic chord, then we can also make lines with material from some of the other chords in that function, and that would be then the E minor 7 and the A minor 7. And some examples of lines could sound like this. Another way you can use this is that you can also reinterpret a basic progression and then start to embellish the reinterpretation, and in that way create some completely different movement on top of the chords that really still will work in the context. So if we take the F major 7 to B flat 7 to C major, so really 4, 4 minor to 1, then we can reinterpret the F major 7, say it's a subdominant chord, so instead of playing it as an F major, we can also just think of another subdominant chord, that would be the D minor. And the B flat 7 we can turn into a 2-5, it would still be a subdominant progression, so F minor 7, B flat 7. And then we can just add embellishment in between, which would be an E minor 7, and then we have this progression. And of course that's one thing to do that with chords, but you can also do this in the solo and it will still work. And you would have a line like this. A short bonus feature that I found from thinking this way is that it gets a little bit easier to just hear and learn songs by ear if you're thinking in functions also. And especially that's really useful if you have students who come in with songs and they're on their phone, because on a phone you can't really hear what the bass is playing, so you can't really hear what kind of chord is there, but you can in a general way kind of hear what the function is that's happening. And it doesn't really matter too much if it's F minor or B flat 7, just as long as you have a basic idea about what is going on, then you can still improvise over it and you can still just pick out enough of the song to use it in the lesson. How do you think about harmony and how do you understand chord progressions? Is it very different from the way that I'm thinking about it and talking about it here? Then leave a comment, because I think it's something that's useful to discuss. As far as I know, I think actually up till like the late 80s, people were mostly not using functional harmony and tonal harmony to describe what was happening in jazz standards, and kind of missing the point, I think, a little bit. So at the time we were not really helping students, and I think this is really something that's changed for the better by introducing this way of thinking. But maybe there's something else that you want to introduce as well, so leave a comment on that.